Okay, let's talk about Europe before contact. At the beginning of the 15th century, one might have predicted that China would establish the world's first global empire. All of Eurasia desired goods from China, including spices, ceramics, and silks. China's fleet of ships also dwarfed Europe's in comparison with a treasure fleet of 300 ships. After China, the Islamic empires were the most powerful. The Ottoman Empire rose to prominence the century before by gaining access and control of trade routes. In the mid-15th century, Europe sought to increase its international presence. Western European kingdoms lay in the shadow of an international economy that revolved around China. The European conquest of America began as an offshoot of the quest for a sea route to India, China, and the islands of the East Indies to acquire and trade the same goods that China and the Islamic empires had access to. For centuries, this commerce had been conducted across land, from China and South Asia to the Middle East and the Mediterranean region. Profit and piety, the desire to eliminate Islamic middlemen and win control of the lucrative trade for Christian Western Europe, developed and combined to inspire the quest for a direct route to Asia. After the Chinese government ended support for long-distance maritime expeditions in 1433, Portugal began to take advantage of the new technologies and techniques of sailing and navigation to begin exploring the Atlantic. The development of the caravel, a ship capable of long-distance travel, and of the compass and quadrant, devices that enabled sailors to determine their location and direction with greater accuracy, made it possible to sail down the coast of Africa and return to Portugal. Today, Africa is the world's poorest continent. In the 15th century, it was known for its wealth. African spices, ivory, and gold had entered the Eurasian market, and Portugal now sought to find more gold for themselves. Portuguese ships began sailing to Africa, setting up trade posts farther down the western coast over the course of the 15th century. These profits, seen by Portugal, inspired other European powers to follow in their footsteps. In the latter part of the century, the Portuguese established sugar plantations on the Atlantic islands, eventually replacing the native populations with thousands of slaves shipped from Africa, an ominous precedent for the New World. Slavery in Africa long predated the coming of Europeans. Traditionally, African slaves tended to be criminals, debtors, and captives in war. They worked within the households of their owners and had well-defined rights, such as possessing property and marrying free persons. It was not uncommon for African slaves to acquire their freedom. Slavery was simply one of the several forms of labor and not the basis of the economy as it would become in many parts of the New World. The arrival of the Portuguese, followed by traders from other European nations, accelerated the buying and selling of slaves within Africa. At least 100,000 African slaves were transported to Spain and Portugal between 1450 and 1500. In 1502, the first slaves were transported to islands in the Caribbean. The transatlantic slave trade and its impact will be discussed in later classes. First, let's talk about this guy. Wonder how many of you know who he is upon sight. Before sailing to North America, Christopher Columbus had sailed for years in the Mediterranean and North Atlantic, studying ocean currents and wind patterns. Columbus knew the Earth was round, but drastically underestimated its size. He believed that by sailing westward, he could relatively quickly cross the Atlantic and reach Asia. No one in Europe knew that two giant continents lay 3,000 miles to the west. Columbus sought financial support for his planned voyage and gained sponsorship from King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain. The financing for Columbus's journey also came from Spanish merchants and bankers, as well as investors from Italian city-states. After sailing for a little over 2 months, the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria set anchor off the coast of the Bahamas in October of 1492. The following year, European colonization of the world began. In 1493, Columbus returned with 17 ships and more than 1,000 men to explore the area and establish a Spanish outpost. He made 2 more voyages to the New World in 1498 and 1502. He went to his grave believing he had found a westward route to Asia. It wasn't until Italian explorer Amerigo Vespucci explored the coast of South Africa between 1499 and 1502 that it became obvious that a new continent had been discovered. The New World would not come to bear Columbus's name, but instead Vespucci's being called America. Vespucci also realized that the native inhabitants weren't residents of the East Indies, but instead were distinct peoples. The speed with which European exploration proceeded in the aftermath of Columbus's first voyage is remarkable. The invention of the printing press in the 1430s had made the spread of information in Europe rapid among the educated minority. News of Columbus's achievement traveled quickly. One writer hailed him as, quote, "a hero such as the ancients made gods of." What did not travel quickly was the news that within a generation of Columbus meeting the Taino Indians, the population had nearly disappeared due to war, overwork, famine, and disease. After reading of Columbus's exploits, others were inspired to follow in his footsteps. Fishing boats from France, Spain, and England were active in Newfoundland in the last years of the 15th century. When it came to exploration and conquest, Spain took the lead. Spanish conquest was grounded in the search for wealth, glory, and the spread of Catholicism. Religious missionaries often accompanied Spanish conquistadores to fulfill the latter part of their conquest. Who's that guy? Well, we're looking at an Aztec map. So who do you think of when you think of who went up against the Aztecs? I'm sure you all know. I'm sure you all are immediately thinking of Hernan Cortez, either because you've read already before reading this, or because popular guy. All right, so the first explorer to encounter a major American civilization was Hernan Cortez, who in 1519 arrived at Tenochtitlan, the nerve center of the Aztec Empire, right? I mentioned that previously. Despite similarities in economic and militaristic practices, the two groups did not peacefully coexist. The Aztecs had gained power through the domination of surrounding groups, and despite similar practices in Europe, the Spanish conquistadores viewed the Aztecs as barbarians. The European knowledge of ocean navigation, metal tools, and firearms put the Aztecs at a great disadvantage. Cortez used his technology and the disgruntled people the Aztecs had subjugated to take the city. Perhaps the most important ally Cortez had was one that he didn't plan on: disease. A smallpox epidemic devastated the city. The Aztecs had no immunity to European diseases and suffered from what is known as a virgin soil epidemic. Okay, virgin soil epidemic. Those contracting the illness have had no previous exposure and therefore are immunologically defenseless. Okay, so they've had no previous exposure to this disease, right? And there are no vaccinations or inoculations or anything like that. So if you get the illness and you have had no previous exposure, you have nothing in your immune system to defend you from it. So, virgin soil epidemic. Those contracting the illness have had no previous exposure and therefore are immunologically defenseless. Okay? The previously feared Aztec Empire lay in ruins, and less than 20 years later the Spanish, this time under Francisco Pizarro, had conquered the Incan Empire in South America. The transatlantic flow of goods and people, sometimes called the Columbian Exchange, altered millions of years of evolution. I cannot stress that enough. It altered millions of years of evolution. Plants, animals, and cultures that had evolved independently on separate continents were now thrown together. Products introduced to Europe from the Americas included corn, tomatoes, potatoes, peanuts, tobacco, and syphilis. Europeans brought wheat, rice, sugarcane, horses, cattle, pigs, sheep, and a host of diseases to the Americas. Indian populations suffered a catastrophic decline because of contact with Europeans and their wars, enslavement, and diseases like smallpox, influenza, and measles. The result was devastating. On Hispaniola, the native population, estimated at between 300,000 and 1 million in 1492, had nearly disappeared 50 years later. The population of Mexico would fall more than 90%, that is 90% in the 16th century. Overall, the death of perhaps 80 million people, close to 1/5 of humankind, in the first century and a half after contact with Europeans, represents the greatest loss of life in human history. Determined to find riches and glory, Spanish explorers embarked on more expeditions to find and conquer larger civilizations like the Aztecs. By the middle of the 16th century, Spain had established an immense empire that reached from Europe to the Americas and Asia. It included the most populous parts of the New World and regions richest in natural resources. Stretching from the Andes Mountains of South America through present-day Mexico and the Caribbean, and eventually into Florida and the southwestern United States, Spain's empire exceeded in size the Roman Empire of the ancient world. In Spanish America, tens of thousands of Indians were forced to work in gold and silver mines, which supplied the empire's wealth. Hundreds of thousands of people flocked from Spain to Spanish America, and the colonists set up governments, churches, and established homes. The Spanish crown ordered wives of colonists to join them in America and demanded that single men marry. However, the population of Spanish women remained low, and the intermixing of colonists and natives soon began. By 1600, mestizos, persons of mixed origin, made up a large part of the urban population in Spanish America. As missionaries were attempting to spread Catholicism amongst the natives in America, Europe was facing a tumultuous religious period, which I will now end this part to talk about that, and then that will be the last part of today's lecture. So one more part, and then we'll be all done with week 1's lecture.